My wife has a gift of evangelism. At home, she has her time with God. She spends some time reading, she journals, she prays. And then she says, Lord, help me today to have some divine appointments when I go to, and then she'll list the stores. And so it's not unusual then when she goes to the produce aisle of a particular store, she's already asked the Lord, who should I talk to?
Jesus never promised his followers an easy path. In fact, he told his disciples that the world would hate them. He sent them out as sheep among wolves. Jesus' words came true in the life of the apostles, and they're still coming true today in the lives of his followers around the world. Join host Todd Nettleton as we hear their inspiring stories and learn how we can help. Right now on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.
Welcome again to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. My name is Todd Nettleton. We are in the studio today with Peter Smith. Peter has been our guest before here on Voice of the Martyrs Radio. You may remember he adopted a country, and I would encourage you to go back and listen. In fact, he adopted the country of Iran more than 2 decades ago. Since then, he's been praying, he's been connecting with ministries that are working in Iran and trying to do whatever he can to further the work of the gospel inside the country of Iran. Again, that's what we talked about the last time he was here. Peter, welcome back to Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
Todd, it's great to be back. Good to see you again.
I know at the beginning of each year, you pray about and look for a word for the year. Mm-hmm. What's your word? What are you thinking about? What are you pondering? What are you praying about this year?
Well, recently at our church, the pastor was in Exodus chapter 33, and it was a case where Moses and Joshua left the camp, went out to a tent where they met with God. Well, in chapter 33, verse 11, it says that Moses had a text on his cell phone, so he had to go back to the...
This is a very modern translation.
Yeah, this is the... So he had to go back to the camp and probably had some discussion with some of his leaders. But then in verse 11, it says that Joshua stayed behind and he lingered with God. And so when our pastor shared that verse, I thought, that's my word for 2024.
Linger.
So there's a lot of good examples of people lingering. For example, in the New Testament, the older lady who was in the temple when Mary and Joseph brought Jesus to be dedicated. You remember the story between Martha. Martha and Mary.
Martha, yeah.
And I remember that Mary chose to linger. I just need to spend more focused time with God just by myself.
Which in our culture and in 2024 and with our cell phones and our busyness, that's a hard thing for a lot of us.
It is.
I would encourage our listeners, maybe God has given you a word for this year. Hey, send me an email. You can come to vomradio.net. There's a comment box at the bottom. Just let me know. What is your word for 2024? What is God showing you? How are you living that out? How are you putting that into practice? This week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio, we are with Peter Smith. He has adopted the country of Iran more than 2 decades ago. Peter, last time you were here, we talked about the process you went through to sort of think through, okay, the challenge came, hey, why don't you adopt a country? Why don't you make this a focused part of your prayer life from this day forward, as the wedding vow says? I know some other parents who have adopted children, and it would be very common for me to ask, well, how's it going? Mm-hmm. How's it going with your adoption of Iran? What is God doing? What is God showing you? What doors is he opening? Because I know he's opened a lot of doors for you to not just pray for Iran, right, but to really be practically involved in seeing the gospel advance there.
Well, Todd, the way I'll explain your question is with 2 words, Uber driver, well, actually 4 words, divorced mother.
Okay.
So the first story is about a woman who lives in a restricted access country, and it was her practice at Christmas time to give away gifts. And so she went to get in her car to drive to the location to get the gifts, but her car wouldn't start. So she thought, wait a minute, I need to go to this place to get these gifts for Christmas, but I can't get there. So what did she do? She called her friendly Uber service. So when she got into the back seat of this Uber car, she noticed around the front mirror a beautiful cross. So she complimented the Uber driver, said, "Thank you so much for having that cross there." And she says, "Well, one of my riders accidentally left it in my car. So I still have it hanging on my mirror, hoping that someday I'll pick that person up again and they can claim their cross. But she said, it's interesting, ever since I hung that cross around my mirror, some days I have really good days where I pick up a lot of clients, make a lot of money, and then some days I just have a few customers and obviously don't make as much money. But always that day, whatever I bring home is just the right amount. So our person in the back seat says, well, who do you think that is? How does that work? So it gave her a chance to share with the Uber driver about Christ. So when they got to the location, she said, would you mind waiting for me? I'll go get my box, and then you can take me back home. So she waited for about 5 minutes, and the lady comes back with this real large box and puts it in the back seat. And then she immediately begins to open up the box because she wants to see, oh, what's inside for Christmas? What do I get to give away? Well, she came across a book called The Real Story of Jesus. Well, The Real Story of Jesus is a 9-minute animated episode starting in Genesis, going clear through to Revelation, telling people how they can have salvation. And so she saw this book in this language of the country that she was in. So as she was getting out of the Uber car, she says, well, here's my gift to you. Merry Christmas. Well, the driver normally would immediately go find another client so she can make more money. But she read this book on the real story of Jesus. So the lady who was formerly in the car says, I need to go talk to her. An hour later, after much discussion, the Uber driver said, yes, I want to become a follower of Jesus.
Wow.
For those of you who are listening here in the U.S., you can have the English version of The Real Story of Jesus by simply going to the website, therealstoryofjesus.com.
And we will give you a link in the show notes this week at vomradio.net. Peter, as I hear that story, I think of several things. I think of the person who left a cross in an Uber car, maybe on accident, maybe not on accident. I think of the fact that Uber driver associated the cross with provision. Mm-hmm. Like she didn't know Jesus. She wasn't walking with Jesus. Maybe she didn't know much at all.
Yeah.
But she somehow understood, ever since I hung that cross there, I've had enough. I've been provided for. It's so interesting how God plants those seeds along the way. I hope that's a challenge for us because, I ride in Uber cars too. And I don't always think, I wonder where our conversation could go while I'm here in this Uber car. I wonder if God is opening a door for conversation. How do you explain that hunger in the Middle East? Because it's not uncommon for us to hear stories like that where somebody is hungry for the gospel.
Well, Todd, the easiest way for me is to think of the parable of the soils. Here in America, unfortunately, our soils are pretty rocky, pretty hard. But in this particular restricted access country, there's a lot of good soil. And so when you plant a seed, it not only bears fruit, but then it goes on this 30, 60, and 100-fold. So it is not unusual. I mean, if we could follow up with this Uber driver, it would not surprise me if she already has family members and friends who have become followers of Jesus because of her testimony.
Yeah. And people sitting in the back seat of her car.
That's right.
Now she does say, well, that's my cross. Let me tell you more about it.
Part B of the story is the woman who got the booklet also has a magazine. It's about a 54-page magazine that shows different topics. Mm-hmm. One is a food section. One's a movie section. Another section is VOM stories of persecuted Christians. And so this lady who gave away the salvation booklet also gave her a magazine. And so it would not surprise me if the Uber driver has that magazine in the back of the seat in front of the person who's taking the ride. So
while we're riding along, you've got time. You can just read some articles.
Yep.
Okay, divorced woman.
Her situation was she was married in this restricted access country. Her husband was a drug addict and physically and emotionally abused her. And so it got to the point where after many, many years, she just said, I can't handle it anymore. The catch was she's got a 12 and 16-year-old daughters. And so she thought, how in the world am I going to provide for my daughters? So around Christmas time, somebody came to their door and left a box. Now, I don't know if the same lady who was riding in the Uber, but in this particular city, the local house churches went door to door and dropped off Christmas gifts, one of which included the salvation booklet that we just talked about. Well, I'll shrink the story, but the divorced woman gave out the salvation book to her 16-year-old daughter and the magazine to her 12-year-old daughter. Well, they consumed them right away. They just went to the rooms, read them, loved it. And so when she got back the salvation booklet from her daughter, she says, I need to read this too. Well, it took her about 3 minutes. It's just a very short book. And as a result, she says, I think I'm ready.
That fast?
That fast. So then she was living with her mom. Her mother had allowed her to move back with her family. And so she wanted to start witnessing to her mom, which again, in this particular case, the story does not end with the mother yet becoming a follower. So Todd, at the end of our presentation today, we're going to ask your listeners, your viewers, to pray for this mother, actually a grandmother also, who would say yes to Jesus. Who knows, maybe they'll host a house church in their home someday.
Amen. We believe by faith that will happen, and we will get to specific ways we can pray. We're talking this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Peter Smith. He has he's been the adoptive dad for the country of Iran for the last 20-plus years. Peter, as we think about Iran, it seems like it's often in the news in good and bad ways. What is happening in the country? Right, I know a year ago we saw the protest everywhere, and there was even talk, this could be what ends the Islamic regime. That hasn't come to fruition at this point in time. Now we have conflict even between the U.S. and Iran. It's back and forth there. I don't think we want to go down the road too far of like the political aspects of this, but what does that mean for our friends who are following Jesus in Iran? How is the conflict and the upheaval, how does that affect them?
Well, when you adopt any country, sooner or later you get to adopt the people. And so I've had the privilege of meeting a lot of believers for this favorite country. One of the groups that I work closely with, unfortunately, they've had family members as well as workers arrested. And the catch is when somebody gets arrested, sometimes it could be months before you hear anything.
So it's like they just disappear.
Yeah. It's like, are they alive? Are they dead?
Oh, my.
Are they being tortured? What's happening? Eventually, in most cases, they do surface again. Usually it's in a jail that's not in your city. It's in a jail somewhere else.
Yeah.
But my point is the number of persecuted believers since a year ago, unfortunately, has gone up.
Is that because of the protest? Were there believers that were trying to be involved in the protest, or is it just an uptick in persecution, or is there not really an explanation? It just is a kind of...
Well, one Persian analogy that I've been told is that when you corner like a squirrel, sooner or later that squirrel will come at you because they feel like they're trapped.
Right.
And so it's possible that some of the religious and governmental leaders feel pressured of what's happening in the world right now. So it could be they find an easy way out by simply going against Christians.
And one of the sad things in that part of the world is that Christians are sort of assumed to be affiliated with America.
Yeah, yes.
America's a Christian nation and you're a Christian, therefore you must like America. You must be. And we see that not only in Iran, that's across the Middle East. When Christians do something or when America does something, it's the Christians who are doing this, even though we who live in America know we're far from a Christian nation. How does that play in right now during this sort of back and forth between America and Iran and kind of one-upsmanship?
Well, let me tell you a personal story. My wife has a gift of evangelism. So in our neighborhood, hopefully when the weather's good, she takes a walk just to exercise, but it also was a chance for her to meet some new neighbors. Well, last year, on 3 distinct times, not the same time each trip, but she met 2 women from this restricted access country.
Interesting how the Lord works.
And so at Christmas time, she opened up our home to some of the women that she met while walking in our neighborhood. And 17 women came.
Wow.
2 of which were from this restricted access country. And when they left, they said, "You made me feel like I was at home." Another thing that my wife has learned to do is to make special Persian food. So as soon as she told them the name of the food that she likes to make,
they were in.
They were friends. So the principle of the story could be that as your listeners are shopping, maybe at a sports event or wherever they're at, there's probably somebody from a different country nearby. In fact, one more update. Since COVID started in March of 2020, my wife has now talked to women from 54 countries while she's at stores shopping. And so I thought, how in the world would you meet 54 nations by just simply doing one act? But she's faithful. And
intentional.
Intentional,
I mean,
yeah.
she's watching for these opportunities.
Yep.
We're talking this week on Voices of Martyrs Radio with Peter Smith. He is active, connected to ministry in the Middle East. Peter, one of the ways that you've lived out this adoption is by connecting with ministries and trying to make sure that Christians in the country that you adopted have access to resources. They have access to Bibles. They have access to audio teachings. They have access even to Christian music. And how has God used that, or how have you been intentional about watching for those opportunities, even with ministries here in America that are doing English things, to say, hey, could you translate that? Could that be used in this country?
Well, let's go back to one of the first things I mentioned about the real story of Jesus. It is now in 8 different languages. By the time your listeners hear this, sometime this summer 2024, we hope to have over 100 different languages.
Awesome.
So again, imagine you're at a store or sporting event, and you find out this person is from a different country. And so you can ask the same question that my wife likes to ask, well, what language do you speak? And so let's say they speak Spanish. And so you could say, hey, I've got a resource that I could share with you that talks about Spanish, how you can have a relationship with Jesus in Spanish. Would you be interested? 99% of the time, my wife gets a yes.
Yeah.
It's very rare that somebody says, no, I don't want that.
Peter, as we think about the coming year, and I think about Iran, and obviously we don't know what's going to happen the rest of the year, what's going on with everything going on right now. What are the things that you're excited about that you see God doing or preparing in Iran or in some of the surrounding nations that are things maybe we can be excited about, but also our listeners we can pray about as we keep going in 2024?
Well, again, I'll give you a couple words to summarize it, then we'll come back and explain it. But the first one is social media, and the second one is printed resources. Social media is a huge opportunity to share the Christian story with people inside this particular country. And so many of them, because of the restrictions placed upon them, they have to use creative ways to get around the barriers to get to that site. And so they'll go to a site and they'll begin doing just a random search, and all of a sudden up pops an opportunity for a Christian site to be watched or listened to. And so social media would be one way in which we could help reach a particular country. Printed resources, again, for security reasons, I'll just simply say that I'm going to use the term point A to point B. Wouldn't it be nice if somehow a beautiful printed resource from point A could get into point B? Now, I do have to tell you, because of all the current Middle East restrictions and other opportunities, we're being very careful how we do this. Unfortunately,
which is wise.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've had some workers who are volunteers who have been killed this past month. They were helping us to go from point A to point B, got to a certain point of the journey, and unfortunately a guard, for whatever reason, chose to shoot at them. And now we're helping to care for the widows and for the children. So there's also not only the good things that are going to happen once those resources get there, but there is a price sometimes to be paid.
And I hope that kind of sobers us to remember to pray. Getting from point A to point B can be very, very challenging. We've seen God do amazing things to open that door and move stuff. But as you say, there are dangers, there are challenges that come with that.
Well, Todd, let me just share one more thing. I use the word seasons. What I mean by that is the last couple of years, the door for activity has almost been wide open. You say, we need to do this, and it happens. Well, in the last couple of weeks, we're saying the same area, but it's not as open as it was before. So maybe the season will be different for a while. Let's pray for a continuation of the open door season.
What are some other ways that our listeners this week can pray for the nation of Iran, maybe can pray for the Middle East region more broadly? How can we pray?
Well, I'm going to start with the word linger. Before they pray, let's encourage our listeners to linger in God's presence. And that's different for each person, but it might include scripture reading, an audio Bible, prayer time. So first one is prayer. Second is, I'm going to use the word food evangelism. As you go to a store to get food this week, be intentional to reach out to somebody in one of the aisles next to you. The third would be resources. We've talked about social media resources. We've talked about other creative ways to do it. But let's specifically pray for this resource that I mentioned earlier, therealstoryofjesus.com. It's a 9-minute animation. It takes you from Genesis to Revelation. And if you've got anybody on your prayer list that you're praying for salvation, this would be an easy tool to text to them. So resources. And then last would be somebody's going to take an Uber ride this week. I don't know who it is, but one of your listeners is going to take an Uber ride. And don't be bashful when you're sitting in the back seat going from wherever it is, from the airport or to your home or however it works out. But just take some initiative to talk to the Uber driver about Jesus.
And maybe have a resource in your bag to hand to them at the end of the conversation, at the end of the trip. I have found in many cities, the Uber drivers are often from some of the nations where Voice of the Martyrs works. Mm-hmm. I've had Uber drivers from Sudan. I've had Uber drivers from Afghanistan, places I haven't been recently. I maybe can't go, but boy, they're here, and we can reach them here. Peter, I always enjoy our conversations. I always enjoy the chance to hang out and hear how God is using you. And I think about, more than 20 years ago, this decision to adopt the country of Iran, to say, we're going to pray for Iran every day. We're going to pray for the people. We're going to get to know about the country. We're going to follow the news of what's going on there. How many doors God has opened off of that decision, and how much his kingdom has been blessed by that adoption. So again, we had a whole conversation with Peter about that process here on Voice of the Martyrs Radio. We'll give you a link to that in the show notes this week. We'll also give you a link to the real story of Jesus. As you mentioned, Peter, by the end of the year, more than 200 languages. That's the plan? For the real story of Jesus, at least 100. 200 would be nice. So okay. So pray for the translation process as well, because obviously that involves a lot of T's to cross and a lot of I's to dot to make that happen. Peter, thank you so much for being with us this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio. You're welcome, Todd. God bless. And thank you for spending this time with us. If you are just now joining us, you can hear this conversation as well as all the other episodes of Voice of the Martyrs Radio at our website, vomradio.net. That's also where you can send me a note. If you have adopted a country, if you are praying for a specific country, let me know. If you have a word for 2024, let me know the word that God has given you this year. I would love to hear from you, again, at our website, vomradio.net. And I hope you'll be back with us next week. We're going to continue to hear what God is doing, the doors that he is opening, the way that his word is going forth in hostile and restricted nations. That's what we talk about every week right here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.